The security situation in northern Mozambique has sharply deteriorated again due to a resurgence of attacks by Islamic State-affiliated insurgents in the Cabo Delgado province. Nearly 60,000 people have fled their homes in 2 weeks due to the attacks that began around the 20th of July. It is a conflict that is, according to people on the ground, bleeding, and the world, they say, is continuing to look away. With me is Piers Pigou, a consultant at the Focus Group, and Tomàs Queface from CaboLigado, a conflict monitoring initiative that has been documenting the insurgency in northern Mozambique since 2020. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
Tomàs, CaboLigado has been tracking this conflict closely. So what are you seeing on the ground?
Okay, just give you an example of what has been happening recently in Cabo Delgado. The insurgents have been moving around the province, and on the 24th of July, they reached the southern district of Chiuri in Cabo Delgado, in which they perpetrated multiple attacks, forcing almost 2,000 people to be displaced from their own houses. The humanitarian situation in Cabo Delgado is very, very complicated at the moment. There are around 1 million displaced people, according to the UN, and only half of them are getting aid and humanitarian assistance, meaning that half of displaced people do not have any sort of help. But with these recent movements and attacks by the insurgents, the situation has been complicated because neither the government nor the humanitarian organizations cannot reach these people and cannot provide the necessary assistance. Well, the humanitarian organizations have complained that because of the shift of focus from other conflicts in Ukraine and in Palestine, Gaza, the support to displacement in Mozambique has reduced significantly. That's what we have been seeing. In terms of government response to these insurgents incursions in Cabo Delgado has been also not very significant. The insurgents for the past 30 days, they moved from the central Cabo Delgado in the Macomia district. They passed through Kisanga and Quissanga, and they reached the south of Cabo Delgado without any challenges, any clashes, any confrontation by Mozambican security forces, which is very worrying. The only groups that are clashing or at least trying to confront the insurgents are local militias called Naparam. But these groups are not prepared, do not have the sufficient equipment in order to deal with these armed groups in Cabo Delgado. Right now, as we're speaking, there are a group of insurgents that are now again moving from the south to the north of Cabo Delgado. And again, there is no opposition to these groups. They have been launching attacks to villages and attacking civilians, but they have been also barricading roads, the main roads, and also charging people and forcing them to pay ransom so that they can be free. So that's the situation at the moment. And also, we have in Cabo Delgado three main forces. We have the Mozambican forces, we have the Rwandan forces, but also in northern Cabo Delgado, in the Nangadi district, we also have the bilateral forces of Tanzania, who also are providing support to Mozambique in order to fight the insurgents. But again, neither the Mozambican forces nor the Rwandan forces have been fully engaged in the conflict at this point. Why is that? It's still a question.
Tomàs has described a movement south and then back north of a particular group of insurgents. And what's clear, and the lack of response from the security forces, which raises questions as to why that's going on. We can confirm that the security forces, for example, in a big attack on a particular village in the district of Chiuri in the south, were given advance notice of this pending attack. A team of, we are told, 25 soldiers were deployed to that area, and that they left very, very quickly as soon as the attack began by a group of between 35 and 50 insurgents that are in this particular group. This appears to be part of a kind of a cyclical issue that we've had with insurgents moving south, probably heading over the Lurio River into Irati district in Nampula province and picking up recruits that have been trained in Nampula and taking them back north. And now we see them cycling back up, not physically cycling, or circling back up, I should say, to the north, back to their main bases in northern Macomia in the Katupa forests. So this is part of a pattern that's been in play. What has been shocking, as Tomàs points out, is the lack of response from the Mozambican forces, who are the point agency there, but also from the Rwandan forces, who have a base in Ankwabi district, not too far away. And this is part of a pattern of Rwandan forces, of which there are 4,000 to 4,500 in the province at the moment, essentially maintaining static and arterial security through the main thoroughfares, the road systems, the main road systems, and in major towns. And what you now see, which is problematic, is in response to the attacks in the south, there's been a slow relocation of Mozambican forces south, weakening their presence in the northern districts, where we're now going to see probably more attacks happening in the next week or so. So this is a problem that we've seen before, in which a former colleague of mine at the International Crisis Group used to describe this is similar to watching bad food being pushed around a plate at the moment, that they never actually get to engage. And it reflects a wider challenge in Mozambique in terms of its counterinsurgency strategy, that there is no strategy to speak of in terms of one that is fit for purpose. And we don't have forces that are fit for purpose in that space at all. So we can expect for the foreseeable future these kinds of attacks to continue. And while certain parts of the province, particularly economic assets such as the LNG operation in northeast Cabo Delgado and other spaces where there are economic assets, the gemfield security, the bauxite mines, the graphite mines and so forth, that those areas are going to be relatively well fortified, whereas the rest of the space in the province remains vulnerable.
Tomàs, can I ask you, has there been a change in the tactics of the insurgents? Do I see more child kidnappings taking place?
Yes, the insurgents have now trying to adapt more and more to the situation on the ground. Just to give you an example, with the fighters in the south, they're now trying to move back to Macomia or even north to the province. And when such movements happen, the insurgents set up roadblocks in order to disperse the security forces throughout the province. And then also, this is becoming cyclical and cyclical in the province. At the same time, in these roadblocks, they charge people, but now based on religion. Yesterday and today, there were two roadblocks on the main highway in Cabo Delgado. They stopped some of the public transportation passes. They divide the passengers based on their religion. They free they fed the Muslims, and then they charge it the Christians 10,000 each metikash. But also we saw a different approach to the Muslim and the Christian communities on the villages and districts in which they passed. Um, as I was explaining at the beginning, the insurgents started the movements from Macomia. They passed through Kisanga and Ankwabi and Shiuri districts. In Macomia and Ankwabi, there was no displacement at all, mostly because those two provinces are majority Muslim. But the same pattern was not seen in Ankwabi and Shiuri, where most of the populations are Christians. And then we saw significant numbers of displacements, more than 50,000 people in only 10 days. And then the other thing that we noticed in the past weeks was that the insurgents were active not just in the south in Chiuri, but it was also active in coastal Macomia, in Muidumbi, and now with this recent attack in Palma. It suggested then now divide it into different groups, and then it's going to be very difficult for the security forces to respond to all these the multiple and diverse threats posed by the Islamic State.
So the LNG project, how is that affected by the current upsurge in violence?
Okay, well, because of the recent roadblocks that actually started in the beginning of this year, that was a new approach by the insurgents. They start setting up roadblocks on the main road linking the south and the north of Cabo Delgado, and that prompted Total Energies to take a decision of stopping all the logistics from the south to the north of the country using the main highway in that province. And then Total Energy forced all the subcontract companies to now shift the logistics to the sea instead of the road. Also, that had a lot of implication to local people in Palma district, as I was telling you earlier. But also, it also questionable to what extent there is a security on the sea as well. 2 months ago, if I'm not wrong, there was an incident with the Russian ship off the coast of Mocimboa da Praia that was attacked by a group of insurgents that were moving with at least 2 boats. They managed to shoot some fires to the ship, but thanks, no one was injured at that incident. That raised some sense also in terms of insecurity to the ships that are going now to navigate through the waters of Cabo Delgado. So yes, it somehow affects Energy, and that's why it is now becoming clear that they are now going to close the area from outside the rest of the province.
Yes, if I may add just to this year, we've seen only 2 or 3 minor incidents in the district of Palma where the LNG project is located on the Afungi Peninsula. And as Tomasz has pointed out, the perimeter of the and the border area of Afungi in terms of the land border has been significantly reinforced by Total. There is an agreement which remains secretive and behind closed doors between Total, the Mozambican state, and we understand Rwanda, in terms of the forces that are still based inside that location, which effectively ironclad that area from the rest of the province. And there are some concerns in play that we've seen in the last couple of weeks of small businesses and others in the Palma district feeling alienated from the security antics and activities of Total Energies in this space. That is of concern in the long run because it will be another area of alienation for the local communities who are already not particularly happy with respect to how Total has been engaging with those communities. So what we're seeing in essence is the reinforcement of what analysts have been calling for some time a green zone approach, where you will have green zones of high maximum security which operate within a wider context of insecurity. Now, the contradiction there is that following the Palma attacks, which led to the force majeure, the ending of operations in April 2021, Total commissioned a study and recommendations by a expert by Christophe Ruffien is the name of the individual who's involved, who made recommendations that security throughout the province was of interest to Total Energies and was in the interest of Total Energies. What we're seeing, it seems to me, is a shift from that position to accepting that you can have hard and strong security inside the Afungi arena, but that you can actually let wider security concerns remain in place outside of that area. So we're likely to see this situation where districts that have been mentioned, such as Macomia, Muidumbi, Meluco, Kisanga, Chiuri, Ankwabe, and others, and Montepuez, which will be vulnerable to ongoing attacks. And there is likely to be an ongoing evolution of competency and capacity. We see a number of analysts claiming that there are only 250 to 300 insurgents in operation, that they've been beaten back from their high of a couple of thousand in 2021. I personally believe that is a lazy analysis that doesn't reflect the realities on the ground, where these people are biding their time because time is on their side, and they can build slowly a fighting force that may number many more hundreds than the ones that are being spoken about at the moment. So I think we need to be extremely careful about what the longer term prospects are in a context where limited hard security competencies are in play in terms of counterinsurgency, and there is almost a fundamental absence of a wider winning hearts and minds from the government in terms of dealing with the underlying factors that have fed into and fed this insurgency over the last 7 to 9 years.
Yes, while we have this dispersion of incidents throughout the province of Cabo Delgado, it's important to outline that yesterday we had an attack in the Palma district in the Maputo village, which is at the border with the Mocimboa da Praia area, which is controlled by the Rwandan. And as far as we know, the Rwandans did not intervene yesterday, which again raises questions about why the Rwandans have reduced their involvement in the conflict. This is something worth to watch.
Does SADC not play a role? Why are the Rwandan troops so ineffective?
Let's give you a little bit of background to this. It's important to remember that the Southern African Development Community's intervention in Mozambique, which followed a deployment 4 years ago in July 2021, came to an end after 3 years in July 2024. At the tail end of that involvement, as SADC forces, known as SAMIN, Southern Africa, SADC's mission in Mozambique, at the tail end of that deployment, there was a major attack on the town of Macomia. This was as the South Africans were withdrawing, and there was a temporary occupation of that town for 2 days. It's the last major assault that involved several hundred insurgents. Now, bear in mind, that's a year ago, and it reflected the challenges that were in play. At the same time, even though SADC was present, as it was drawing down its troop presence, the insurgents were establishing themselves in a sort of mini caliphate presence in the towns of Kitirajo and Mokojo, where they were holding a lot of meetings with the communities. Their communities were living side by side. Those that had decided that it was perhaps easier for them to stay in that area than it was to continue with the insecurities and the vagaries of trying to live in a semi-displaced arena back in Macomia central town, subject to abuse from the Mozambican forces at times. This has been an ongoing complaint in that area. Now, with SAMIN out of that area, Rwanda reinforced those areas and brought in hundreds more troops, lifting their presence from a couple of thousand of police and military to 4,500 presence, and took over the responsibilities for security essentially in the areas where SAMIN had been, particularly where the South African contingent, the backbone of the SAMIN operation, had been in Macomia. But they are as I said previously, they are operating essentially on static security duty and so forth. But in order to remove and deal with the presence on the Macomia coastline, they attacked insurgents in that area for the first time with helicopter gunships in a way that we'd not seen before. Now, they didn't beat the insurgents. The insurgents retreated. This has been their tactic since 2021. They do not seek confrontation. They melt back into the forests, essentially. So, of course, this appears on face value as an enormous success for counterinsurgency operations. But in effect, all they have done is push them back into other areas for them to fight another day. And since then, we have seen no serious counterinsurgency operations in play. There are no aerial assets to speak of in play, which are absolutely critical for any kind of counterinsurgency. And questions have been raised about, well, what are the Rwandans doing there? They were introduced at the beginning as a very effective force that displaced thousands of insurgents, tackled insurgents in their strongholds and bases, introduced new modalities of community policing in areas of Mocimboa da Praia and Palma, and there was a lot of positive feedback. There was a lot of propaganda, and the Rwandans had embedded journalists in their ranks, which gave the impression that we were on a one-way ticket to solution in Mozambique. Veteran counterinsurgency watchers, I think, however, were much more cynical. And I think you found this from the analysts that are in play. And the long-term watchers, like my colleague here today, Tomàs Queface, who's been watching this for a very long time, will have a more temperate understanding, I think, of exactly what the Rwandans have achieved. And there are questions now about, well, perhaps the Rwandans aren't getting the payback that they thought that they would be receiving, that had been promised to them by the previous president, Mr. Nyusi, and that under the new government of Daniel Chapo, they're not getting the kind of goods that they felt that they could get. So I think there are a number of tensions in play behind the scenes that relate to the financing of this operation. Bear in mind, the Rwandans have claimed consistently that they're paying for this operation. Can you imagine how much it costs to put 4,500 people with troop rotation into that? This is tens of millions of dollars. While the European Union have given them a little bit of support, it adds up to really no more than about $25–30 million, if even that. It doesn't add up to the volume of funds that it would take to underwrite an operation that's been in play for 4 years. So who's paying? That's a big question that hasn't been answered. How much are Mozambique paying? How much have they forward mortgaged their oil revenues? And in particular, how much is TotalEnergies and the French paying? Because there's an interesting equivalence between the foreign development funding coming out of Paris to Rwanda with the amounts of money that it is estimated it is costing the Rwandans to operate in Mozambique.
I'm sure you want to add to that, Thomas, about the effectiveness of the Rwandan troops and who is paying them.
Well, I think Piers made it very, very clear. The fact that, yes, when the Rwandans arrived in Mozambique in 2021, it is this perception that they are a very effective force which maintains some sort of security in the districts of Palma and Mocimboa da Praia at the north. And then when they were deployed to Anfabi district, which is farther to the south, the plan was to allow them to create such a safe zone for the economic projects along the N14, which is the road that links the capital Pemba and Montepuez. But we have seen that the insurgents have been able to cross the positions of the Rwandans and manage to move back to the south. In Macomia, in particular, the Rwandans launched an operation last year around August in order to eliminate all the insurgents' bases throughout Macomia coast. But as far as we know, the insurgents remain there. They continue to have a very good position. They continue to engage with the local forces, and from there they continue to send fighters to the south, to the west, and also to the north of Cabo Delgado province. So Macomia and Queteraju continue to remain very strategic place for the insurgents, and they continue to attack both Rwandan forces as well as Mozambican forces from that position. And yes, we were expecting that the Rwandans will be able to pacify Macomia the same way that they did so in Palma and Mocimboa da Praia, but that has not been the case. And again, the lack of involvement, the lack of engagement by the Rwandans in Macomia is something that we've been questioning a lot, and African intelligence and all the analysts have suggested that yes, there is this problem of payments that are not going as it was expected, that might be affecting this situation. And now and now also we're seeing because of the lack of involvement by engagement by the Rwandans, we see that the Mozambican forces are trying somehow to take the lead on the counter-insurgents efforts, but they've been also paying a higher toll. Just to remind the audience, in the past 2 to 3 months, Mozambican forces sustained lots of casualties. Just to give you an example, between May and June, they lost more than 40 soldiers in different IS attacks into their own positions in Muidumbi and Macomia areas. And then it raised the questions whether the Mozambican forces are ready to take the lead in the counter-insurgents efforts once or if the Rwandans leave Mozambique.
Yeah, can we look at SADC? So SADC is not involved anymore. Do the two of you think SADC should be involved, especially seeing that Mozambique is on South Africa's border? Should there be greater involvement of South Africa, of SADC in the Mozambican conflict?
There's a rather unfortunate history relating to how SADC and Mozambique have interfaced on the insurgency and the issues around the insurgency. Certainly from about 2020, in the first quarter of 2020, when Zimbabwe was actually the chair of the SADC's organ for defense, politics, and security, that there was an attempt by President Mnangagwa in April 2020 to get President Nyusi to come to the table, really. And we saw during the rest of 2020 pressure from SADC to get the Mozambican state and presidency to kind of come to the table about, well, what's your needs? How can we assist? There was resistance from inside Mozambique to this. Now, the dynamics and the politics of that, I don't think have been properly explained as to what was really going on. But in general, there was a resistance, and understandably so in some quarters, to a foreign intervention. There's a generic concern around those issues. But given the problems of how the insurgency advanced in that particular year, and we saw a massive expansion in displacements during 2020, and activities which were simply not being met by the Mozambican security forces. And this led to this situation that we saw with the overrunning in Palma in March 2021. And it was that incident which really forced the Mozambique's hand to come to the table, with SADC insisting that there was now a regional threat around which they had to intervene. And they dispatched a mission in April 2021 to go and assess the damage. Although even then, the Mozambicans state played hardball. They didn't allow the assessment team to do a proper evaluation. And at the same time, President Nyusi went running off to Kigali to talk to President Kagame and organized behind SADC's back a intervention from the Rwandan forces, who managed to get their boots on the ground a week or so before Salmon did in 2021 in July. So that's when we saw the two deployments, and Mozambique also then decided, in terms of theaters of operation, that Rwanda would have the two key districts relating to the LNG project of Palma and Mocimboa da Praia, whereas the Salmon forces were given other, and you could say much more challenging, areas to operate in around Nangade, right up on the border there with Tanzania, Widumbi district, and Macomia, and some of the other areas that have been badly affected south of that, Kisanga and so forth. And this really was part of the ongoing problem that we then saw playing out as the both SADC forces, the SAMIN forces, and the Rwandans and the Mozambicans operating in theory together on the same side, but not cooperating effectively, not sharing intelligence effectively, not working on counterinsurgency strategies together effectively. So you had a kind of fragmented response, again, with this push for SAMIN really to get out. And it was interesting, within the first 8 months, SAMIN itself, in terms of its political dialogue around the deployment, was saying, well, we're already moving from a particular set of scenarios. They called it Scenario 6 in terms of the AU's scenarios around dealing with conflict, of sort of high-level peace enforcement and response to the insurgency, to level 5, or Scenario 5, which was, well, we can move towards a peacekeeping environment. And they put in place in 2021, 2022, a kind of peacekeeping element to the program, which was a bit of an afterthought, with a gender-related component and a community policing relating component. And these things never really got off the ground. But they were looking at an exit strategy before they'd even had space really to consolidate the hard security situation. So they exited, as I said, in July 2024, with the claim that they had achieved what they had set out to do. Now, of course, anyone watching this insurgency knew that that really was putting lipstick on the frog, and really did not reflect the realities on the ground. And still today we have that is the official position of SADC, that they achieved what they had to do. Clearly, as you can see from the security situation, that has not been achieved. And I think SADC still has Mozambique on its radar in terms of it being an item on its broader framework, but you will no longer see Mozambique as a key item in the agenda of the Organ for Politics, Defense and Security, notwithstanding the fact that there is a very, very serious security situation ongoing in the province of Cabo Delgado.
So, Piers, isn't it a worry that ISIS is actually moving down further and further down south in Africa? And is that a threat to South Africa?
Well, Islamic State have themselves evolved over the years, over the last decade, from a kind of a high position of having their own caliphate in Syria and Iraq, to being in a situation now where the African insurgencies that they are ostensibly involved in have become their kind of poster children for their brand of terrorism. So we see operations in West Africa, Central Africa, the Horn, and in Mozambique. So the Mozambique insurgency was given a caliphate status in May 2023. Now, this was unusual because they had a particular franchising model which required certain conditions to be in place before that franchise, that caliphate, waliat status as they call it, could be given. Now, given their own shifting conditions, they have changed the conditions for that waliat status and went ahead. So we've got to bear in mind that there's a lot of propaganda in play from Islamic State. And part of understanding the insurgency in Mozambique is understanding the nature of local dynamics with the international efforts of a terrorist movement that is trying to saddle this insurgency for its own devices, for its own propaganda purposes, and so forth. And that's a tension that we see play out in certain areas. It may seem unusual, but in some parts of the world, actually Islamic State positioning has been a moderating influence on some of the internal dynamics. We saw this with Boko Haram a number of years ago. I'm not saying that's the case in Mozambique, but there clearly is an intention to extend their operations and their activities. Now, there are things we need to look at. We have seen Islamic State activity in South Africa, but South Africa has never received a waliat status. There is real concern, particularly articulated by the United States, that has designated individuals in this country as being part of Islamic State. And there has been a kind of a concern about how South African security agencies have addressed that issue. And we've seen a number of efforts through our courts to prosecute people in relation to alleged Islamic State activities. But these are not officially designated Islamic State by Islamic State Central, which is a virtual entity really at this stage. Should we be concerned? Yes, we should be, not necessarily about what this might mean for activities of Islamic State, although there have been Islamic State related activities from what some may call lone wolves or groups of individuals that would like that kind of status, whether it relates to some of the activities. And we last saw, for example, in December 2020, the shootings at the Poppies restaurant in Melville and the shootings from the Newtown Bridge, the bomb attacks in Verulam and in various shopping centres in the years before that. These have been isolated incidents that we've seen. This is about individuals down here. And then we have individuals in this notorious case that's on at the moment about the abduction of Abadiga. And the involvement of this rogue South African National Defence Force team. And understanding all of these connections is important. And we should understand that South Africa has been a kind of almost a base for financing as well. And that's been one of the big concerns relating to the grey listing of South Africa by the Financial Action Task Force. So there are issues that relate to the South African situation, but we're not going to see a sweeping army of Islamic State militants flowing through Mozambique into South Africa. But we should not be complacent about how Islamic State may try to influence developments in this area. And it does not mean that there may not be some incidents in this country that are by individuals who are affiliated, radicalized and affiliated to Islamic State. One doesn't want to be alarmist about this, but we need to keep very close eye on how these issues are percolating, not only in Mozambique, but how they relate to dynamics in Tanzania and also into other countries like Malawi and the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Yes, the insurgents have now trying to adapt more and more to the situation on the ground. Just to give you an example, with the fighters in the south, they're now trying to move back to Macomia or even north to the province. And when such movements happen, the insurgents set up roadblocks in order to disperse the security forces throughout the province. And then also, this is becoming cyclical and cyclical in the province. At the same time, in these roadblocks, they charge people, but now based on religion. Yesterday and today, there were two roadblocks on the main highway in Cabo Delgado. They stopped some of the public transportation passes. They divide the passengers based on their religion. They free the fret the Muslims, and then they charge it the Christians 10,000 each metikash. But also we saw a different approach to the Muslim and the Christian communities on the villages and districts in which they passed. Um, as I was explaining at the beginning, the insurgents started the movements from Macomia. They passed through Kisanga and Ankwabi and Shiuri districts. In Macomia and Ankwabi, there was no displacement at all, mostly because those two provinces are majority Muslim. But the same pattern was not seen in Ankwabi and Chiuri, where most of the populations are Christians. And then we saw significant numbers of displacements, more than 50,000 people in only 10 days. And then the other thing that we noticed in the past weeks was that the insurgents were active, not just in the south, in Chiuri, but they were also active in coastal Macomia, in Muidumbi, and now with this recent attack in Palma. It suggests that they're now divided into different groups, and then it's going to be very difficult for the security forces to respond to all these multiple and diverse threats posed by the Islamic State.
Should the international community do more with regard to Mozambique?
Oh, maybe I can start. I think it's important to point out that the international community, if we're looking at the West, has provided a certain amount of support into the Mozambican setting. The European Union in particular, if one looks at its involvement and support, has provided significant support for a training program for the Mozambican military. Also, in terms of its development and humanitarian assistance, it's a large spend, one of the biggest spends outside of its Ukrainian commitments at the moment globally. However, it doesn't seem to be joined up together effectively with other spends from other parts of the world. But as we see in the reshifting and resetting of global geopolitics and economic and development interests, we see a turning away of eyes from conflicts such as the one in Cabo Delgado, which effectively have been relatively small in terms of the body count compared to, for example, other conflicts in West Africa or in Sudan or in Somalia and these kinds of places. And this feeds a kind of complacency because there's a hierarchy, of course, of interest that's in play. And of course, the Middle East, for understandable reasons, gets a lot of attention in this context. Conflicts such as those in Cabo Delgado get masked. I've just come back from 3 weeks in the UK where I try and check the newspapers and so forth. Not a single mention of Mozambique or this conflict, really, unless you're talking about very specialist publications on there. So there are really no eyes in the global north on this situation and not much attention. And that should reinforce the commitment from leadership on the continent, really, to pay attention to these situations while they are still in their relative infancy. And really, if they don't engage with the underlying factors that are in play, we really are going to be faced with an embedded and entrenched problem in Mozambique that will have no chance of being resolved either through hard security or the wider human security issues that need to be addressed.
Tomàs?
Yes, I will draw attention to the humanitarian aspect of the conflict. As I point out in the beginning, we have more than 1 million displaced people in Cabo Delgado that are spread also in Nampula province. By May, the World Food Program will only provide assistance to around 400,000 people. That is less than 0.5% of displaced people. But then by June, the World Food Program say they will only provide support to 200,000 people. That is only 25% of displaced people in Cabo Delgado conflict. Well, this is alarming. And since Cabo Delgado is also facing other humanitarian catastrophes due to the cyclones and so on, we need to find new ways on assisting these people, not just in terms of food and other materials, but also in terms of psychological support of these people, because these people have been engaging in all these situations for more than 7 years. It's a lot and significant, and the world needs to see and look for the conflict and the situation in Cabo Delgado province.
Piers Pigou and Tomàs Queface, thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.